In this lecture, you will learn about the growing economy, Washington's presidency, Hamilton's economic plan, the Norwest Ordinance, and the Haitian Revolution. With the amendments in place, the Washington administration will turn its attention to the economy. We will see dramatic increases in the international price of grain in the 1790s. The high prices motivated American farmers to boost agricultural production for the export trade, which in turn generated new jobs for millers, coppers, dock workers, and ship and wagon builders. Cotton production in the southern states also underwent a boom, spurred by market demand and the invention of the cotton gin. The establishment of the U.S. Post Office in 1792 and the surge of road building also stimulated the economy. The post office and road system created a communication and transportation network needed for economic growth. By the 1800s, a dense network of dirt, gravel, and black roadways connected cities and towns in southern New England and the Middle Atlantic states. A third development, boosting the economic resurgence, was the growth of commercial banking. As you may remember, the most pressing problems facing the new government were economic. As a result of the revolution, the federal government had acquired a huge debt, $54 million, including interest. The states owed another $25 million. The upturn in the economy, however, suggested that the government might soon be able to pay its debt. So 10 days after Alexander Hamilton became Secretary of the Treasury, Congress asked him to report on ways to solve the nation's financial problems. Hamilton developed a program that intended the use of governmental fiscal policies that strengthened federal power at the expense of the states and make it in the immediate interest of the moneyed men to cooperate with government in its support. Such an alliance, in his view, was indispensable for the survival and growth of the United States. Thus, in January of 1790, Alexander Hamilton came up with a plan that called for the federal government to assume the state debts and add them to the federal debt, in effect consolidating the federal power over the states. Hamilton's goal was to make the new country credit worth, not debt free. Hamilton's plan was controversial. States that had largely paid their debts saw it as unfair because they would be taxed to pay off the debts of other states. And it also signaled a potential power grab by the new government to subordinate the states. However, Hamilton argued that the federal debt will still be public debt, but it will be secured, supported by citizens' confidence in the new government. The second and third major elements of Hamilton's economic plan were his proposal for a national bank of the United States and his program to encourage domestic manufacturing. Hamilton modeled his plan for the Bank of the United States on European central banks. According to his plan, the federal government will hold 20% of the bank's stock, in effect making the bank the government's fiscal agent, and the other 80% of its capital will come from private investors. In order to pay the interest on the large national debt, Hamilton convinced Congress in 1791 to pass a 25% tax on whiskey to be paid by the farmer when he bought his grain to the distillery, then pass on to the individual whiskey consumers in the form of higher prices. Hamilton's tax proved very unpopular. In 1791, farmers in western parts of Pennsylvania, Virginia, Maryland, the Carolinas, and throughout Kentucky complained to Congress about the tax. In this cartoon, the discontent to the Whiskey Act was expressed by the representation of an evil imp hooking this whiskey tax collector by the nose to deliver him to the gallows, where he is roasted over a flaming barrel of whiskey. Initially, simple evasion of the law was the most common response, and the tax proved hard to collect. However, in western Pennsylvania, in the spring of 1794, the situation intensified when a stubborn tax collector filed charges against 75 farmers and distillers for tax evasion. The event came to be known as the Whiskey Rebellion. The Whiskey Rebellion was essentially an uprising led by farmers in western Pennsylvania in response to the tax. Around 7,000 Pennsylvania farmers planned a march on Pittsburgh to protest the hated tax. As they marched, some believed that the protesters planned to attack the city. As a response to the march, Washington nationalized the Pennsylvania militia and set out at the head of the 13,000 soldiers. However, by the time the army arrived in September, the demonstrators had dispersed. Nevertheless, the Whiskey Rebellion presented an opportunity for the new federal government to flex its muscle and stand up to civil disorder. Aside from dealing with the debt, an urgent task of the new government was to take charge of Indian affairs while avoiding the cost of warfare. Some 20,000 Indians affiliated with the Greeks occupied lands extending from Georgia into what is now Mississippi, and border scrimmages with land-hungry Georgians became a frequent occurrence. Secretary of War Henry Knox and President Washington singled out one Greek chief, Alexander McGillivray, with whom to negotiate. McGillivray's multi-ethnic and multicultural background helped him to connect with both white and Native Americans. The Americans offered substantial terms to McGillivray, and most notably, a guarantee of the Greeks' extensive tribal lands. McGillivray sent the Americans away initially. However, a year later, negotiations resumed, and the Treaty of New York was signed, guaranteeing Greek tribal lands with the promise of boundary protection by federal troops, as well as money and trade goods. The Greeks promised to accept the United States alone as its trading partner. The Treaty of New York, as eventually became known, joined a list of treaties never fully implemented between the United States and Native peoples. The chief significance of the U.S. diplomacy with the Greeks in the 1790s is that despite efforts to find a different approach to U.S. Indian affairs, in the end, the demographic imperative of explosive white population growth and westward moving land-seeking settlers, together with land speculation, meant that confrontation with native populations will continue. Unlike the Creeks, the Ohio Valley tribes were even less willing to negotiate with the new federal government. After the 1784 Treaty of Fort Sandwich, Indian groups local to Ohio stood their ground. British troops still occupied half a dozen forts in the Northwest and sustained Indians' claims to that land. However, if you recall, under the Northwest Ordinance, the federal government began serving eastern Ohio with settlers eager to buy. So Washington sent the U.S. Army into western Ohio. He then had Fort Washington built in 1789 at the site of present-day Cincinnati. The fort quickly became the command post for 3 major invasions against the Indians. As natives resisted settlement, the encroachment troops led by General Josiah Harmar suffered a humiliating defeat at the hand of Miami and Shawnee Indians. This defeat led to renewed efforts to clear Ohio for permanent American settlement. In 1791, General Arthur St. Clair led 2,000 men, accompanied by 200 women camp followers, to fight the Miami and Shawnee Indians. He will too be defeated by the natives, and over 900 lives were lost in St. Clair's defeat. Then Washington doubled the American military presence in Ohio and appointed a new commander, General Anthony Wayne. Throughout 1794, Wayne's army engaged in skirmishes with Shawnee, Delaware, and Miami Indians. The decisive action came in August of 1794 at the Battle of Falling Timbers, which resulted in a major defeat for the Indians. In 1795, Indian and American representatives negotiated a treaty in which Indians succeeded most of Ohio to Americans in exchange for goods. The treaty brought temporary peace to the region, but it did not bring back a peaceful life to the Indians. Eventually, settlement expansion will continue in the years to come. While Indian battles engaged the American military, the French Revolution captured the imagination of Americans. The French Revolution began on July 14, 1789, when 20,000 French men and women stormed the Bastille, a hated royal fortress. France then experimented with the constitutional monarchy for 3 years. But in 1792, Austria and Prussia invaded France, and French revolutionaries responded by deposing King Louis XVI, placing him on trial and executing him. A general war erupted in Europe, pitting revolutionary France against a coalition of monarchies led by Britain. With two brief interruptions, this war lasted 23 years. In the United States, many Americans initially celebrated the victory of the French people. However, as the French Revolution continued, many anti-French Revolution sentiments also began to run deep, and news of the beheading of thousands of French people, including the monarch, caused many Americans to seek ways to stay neutral. These divisions between pro-French and anti-French Revolution Americans began to intensify when England and France went to war in 1793. With the French and the English at war, the Washington administration was presented with a difficult question. Who do they help? Washington believed that the involvement in the European war would weaken the new nation before it firmly established its own independence. The president, however, faced a problem. During the American Revolution, the United States had signed an alliance with France and had won independence as a result of French aid. Washington then took the position that while the United States would continue to repay its war debts to France, it would refrain from supporting the French Republic. In April 1793, he issued a proclamation of neutrality stating that the conduct of the United States will be friendly and impartial toward the belligerent parties. The Neutrality Proclamation fit Washington's goal of staying out of the European wars. However, American ships continued to trade between the French West Indies and France, incurring the wrath of England. In response to the capture of more than 300 American merchant vessels by British forces, Washington sent John Jay to England to negotiate commercial relations in the British West Indies. Secure compensation for the seized cargoes, produce reimbursement for southern planters whose slaves were lured away by the British Army, and persuade the British to vacate frontier forts. These demands will essentially lead to the Jay Treaty. The Jay Treaty secured limited trading rights in the West Indies, but failed to address all the terms the United States wanted and granted Britain leniency when it came to troop withdrawal from the frontier. It also failed to secure reimbursement for slaves removed by the British after the Revolution. Moreover, when newspapers published the terms of the treaty, powerful opposition emerged. Nevertheless, the Senate passed the controversial treaty by a vote of 20 to 10. The House narrowly approved the funds necessary to implement the treaty, however. In addition to the Indian Wars in Ohio and the European wars across the Atlantic, a third bloody conflict to the south polarized and even terrorized many Americans in the 1790s. The Haitian Revolution was a complex event involving many participants, including the diverse local population of Haiti and 3 European countries. The French Revolution of 1789 was the immediate catalyst for the rebellion in this already tense society. White Americans followed the revolution with fascinated horror through newspapers and refugees' accounts. The Haitian Revolution provoked the fear of a race war in many white Southern Americans. And many Black American slaves also followed the news, amazed by the successful revolution by slaves. A full-blown slave rebellion that will take over the government will never take place in the United States. However, in late August of 1800, close to 1,000 slaves, led by a 24-year-old slave named Gabriel, planned to end slavery in Virginia by attacking Richmond. According to Gabriel's plan, some slaves will set fires in the city warehouse district. Others would attack Richmond's white residents, seize weapons, and capture Virginia's governor, James Monroe. However, on August 30, two enslaved men revealed the plot to their master, who notified authorities. Faced with bad weather, Gabriel and other leaders postponed the attack until the next night, giving Governor Monroe and the militia time to capture the conspirators. After briefly escaping, Gabriel was seized, tried, and hanged along with 25 other slaves. Their execution sent the message that others will be punished if they challenge slavery. Subsequently, the Virginia government increased restrictions on free people of color. Trying to make clear that the United States was setting forward a republic and not a monarchy, Washington will make the decision not to run for re-election. He had avoided war with Britain, suppressed Native Americans in the Old Northwest, and opened the Ohio Country to white settlement. Moreover, by 1796, Washington was able to retire gracefully. However, as he stepped down from the presidency, there were still many things that worry him, and he will convey these worries in a farewell address published in a Philadelphia newspaper in September 1796. In it, he announced his retirement and offered his countrymen his advice on various issues. In his address, the president complained bitterly about the effects of the spirit of party and warned his countrymen against the growth of partisan divisions. His address will resonate with numerous presidents at different times in our history. That is all for now. Please make sure you watch the next video lecture.